Last week, on the one-year anniversary of January 6th, the mainstream media spent a whole lot of airtime condemning the Capitol riots, and they actually saw their ratings take a dip with the coverage of it. According to numbers from Nielsen Media Research, CNN and MSNBC spent over 1,600 minutes on reliving January 6th. Over the day, Fox News garnered 1.6 million total viewers and beat both networks in every hour of coverage across age groups.
CNN hit back at Fox News for mocking the media over the coverage of the riots and for, quote, continuing to mislead or just brazenly lie to their audiences about the attack on the Capitol. Deputy Opinion Editor at Newsweek and author Batya Ungar-Sargon joins us now to discuss. Batya, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
And so, can you break down for us, how it went for the networks relative to, say, a typical midday broadcast?
There was increased interest, but I have to say there's a little bit of misinformation being flung around here. CNN has accused Fox News of not covering it, of ignoring the anniversary of January 6th, and that's simply false. Every hour on the hour, they opened the broadcast with some kind of attention paid to the event, and then they moved on to other topics of importance to the American people. So it's simply false that they weren't covering it. They also didn't give a platform to people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz, who are out there defending the insurrection. They platformed Adam Kinzinger, who's part of the committee investigating it. And so there was a very clear point of view that you saw on Fox that they were very much rewarded with by their viewers who stuck with them, which was that something terrible happened, and let's not overstate its importance or, tie it to the downfall of our democracy or whatever.
Yeah, and Senator Ted Cruz was pressed by Tucker Carlson for his language amid the riots last year. Cruz had tweeted out that the attack on the Capitol was carried out by terrorists, a word Carlson urged Cruz to backtrack on. Let's watch.
The reason I use that word is for a decade I've used that word for people that violently assault cops. I use that word all in 2020 for the Antifa and BLM terrorists that assaulted cops and firebombed police cars. But I agree, it was a mistake to use the word yesterday because the Democrats and the corporate media have so politicized it. They're trying to paint everyone as a terrorist, and it's a lie. Exactly. And by the way, I've spoken out vocally against your exchange you just had. They want to paint us as Nazis. Yes, I know, it's scary. That is what they're trying to do. And look, I'm the one leading the fight in the Senate against this garbage. And it's what I have been doing, and it's what I'll continue doing.
CNN's Jim Acosta then called out Cruz for his balking to Carlson. Here's that.
That was a flaccid moment. And I know comparisons have been made to Reek from Game of Thrones, but I was thinking the Gimp from Pulp Fiction. At this point, if Cruz wants to head to Cancun, I don't blame him. Somebody get this man a margarita. I'll be buying.
And now former Trump press secretary Stephanie Grisham, who resigned amid the attacks and has written a book critical of Trump, is telling the Washington Post just how much influence Fox News hosts had on Trump and the White House at large, with anchors having direct communication with the president of his staff. So I did think Cruz was kind of humiliating himself by, not kind of sticking to the language that he used. What do you think, Batya?
Well, I think if you called, Antifa and BLM activists terrorists, and then the argument is that the left was ignoring that violence and, talking up the violence on January 6th, you shouldn't then go and, not use that word for January 6th, right? If the argument is that the left has been hypocritical, then you shouldn't then have a lower standard for your own side.
Exactly.
I will say, though, that something that really bothers me is the obsession at CNN and other networks on January 6th as a kind of violence that everyone must talk about all the time, when we know that there is actual violence across this country happening in those same Democrats' backyards, historic rise in murder that they will never ever talk about. And they want us to sit here and obsess over something that could have been violent against Congress members, and yet none of them were actually harmed, when they won't talk about the actual violent harm that's happening to their own constituents. Talk about hypocrisy.
So digging in more on that bizarre Cruz capitulation to Tucker Carlson, his logic was sound. I mean, just his own internal logic. If he's going to say that anybody that if Antifa or a Black Lives Matter protester attacks a cop, then I'm going to call them a terrorist, then naturally you should call a January 6th person who attacks a cop a terrorist. Like, that was his internal logic. That's consistent. When he backed off of it, what was stopping him from reevaluating his entire thesis that all of these Americans
Yeah, and if that's what Tucker was trying to get him to do, that was great.
But Tucker didn't push him
demonizing
to that.
everyone as terrorists is. I mean,
But Tucker demonizes. Relentlessly demonizes Antifa and BLM.
Does he call them? I don't know if he calls them terrorists or not.
Well, but I'll tell you something interesting. Have you guys watched his documentary Patriot Purge?
Not yet. I searched for it on YouTube, and I was like, oh, yeah, of course, YouTube's not going to have that.
It spends a lot of time sort of obliquely criticizing the Patriot Act and the sort of overreach against...
Which is great!
Exactly. So I think that is really the question. Are you being consistent in who you're calling terrorists and how you're, or was the message of Patriot Purge like it's okay to do it to them as long as you're not doing it to American citizens, right? So it's very interesting. Yeah, no, I totally agree with you, Ryan. Why didn't he then say, look, you know what, I'm going to not use the word terrorist here because it's not applicable. And you know what, maybe I'm not going to use it against, BLM rioters either. No, instead what he said was, because the Democrats are politicizing the use of the word terrorist in this case, even though I still believe it's apt, I'm not going to use it. And of course, that's super lame. You can't allow the other side to dictate the terms of what words mean.
Well, the weird thing that we just kind of gloss over all the time, we and everybody, whoever placed those pipe bombs, that's terror. Like that. I mean, that's an effort at terror. There were a couple pipe bombs placed at the RNC and the DNC. Such a bizarre mystery that we've never really gotten to the bottom of. We don't know who on earth did this, and it's just kind of like, oh yeah, and by the way, there were a bunch of pipe bombs. Huh? Okay.
Well, I mean, this is a fair kind of, I think, thing to point out. Jim Antle on Twitter, who's a right-leaning writer and editor, was saying that we don't treat the baseball shooting as, does the media talk about that as terrorism? And then someone was like, well, yes. And he goes, oh, really? What day did it happen?
I saw that.
Nobody knows, right? It's not January 6th is a date that is etched in the mainstream media's mind, like the same way that September 11th is.
And I think there's a reason for this. And Batya, you're familiar with the kind of the history of uprisings and movements and revolutions around the world. Like, what was the Fidel Castro was the July 26th movement. If you have a movement combined with some type of spectacular act of violence, then that day gets commemorated because it's linked to the movement. September 11th linked to the Al Qaeda kind of that was a movement. That was a global movement, and I guess the Bernie crank who shot Scalise, it was I think in people's minds that wasn't connected to any type of movement. It was more an insane person, like the person who shot John Lennon. It's not, what day did that happen?
Right. But yeah, but then that puts us in the position of trying to determine.
What day was Reagan shot?
Your crazy behavior is connected to some ideology. But yours is. But then it starts to get people who shoot people are almost crazy by definition. So then it's like looking for, we want to explain it. We want there to be some clear reasoning.
Well, they're not necessarily like the July 26th revolutionaries. They weren't crazy.
Right.
They won. That's the difference. If you win, you're not crazy.
That's the difference.
Yeah.
I will point out that, I think you can't really call 700 people, which is the number of people who have been charged with January 6th, representative of Trump's base, which is about, 74 million of our fellow Americans, right? Many, many Trump voters, including the Trumpiest people I know. I was on the horn with them all day on January 6th, and they were all condemning it. They were all condemning any acts of violence. The fact that Trump himself seemed to be very much enjoying it. So what you had was, this figurehead who was very much enjoying it and refusing to call it off. And then 700 people acting in a very ugly, violent way, and then 74 million people stuck in the middle. So I think that to call it representative of the movement is a little bit wishful thinking on behalf of Democrats who are worried that they can't beat Trump where they are supposed to be beating him, which is at the ballot box.
The people who went into the Capitol weren't even representative of the people gathered that day, right? 99% of which who didn't do anything illegal or wrong and just engaged in First Amendment protected activity. But anyway.
We call it mini formation psychosis.
What's that?
Mini formation psychosis.
Mini formation psychosis.
That's now my theory.
Okay, well, you're going to get fact-checked, I think, by Twitter for that. Oh, there's a little insular rising humor here. All right, Batya, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll be back with more Rising right after this.